Look closely at this skull. In the 1980s, under a quiet vicarage in Repton, England, archaeologists uncovered a scene from a nightmare. A mass grave containing the tangled, chaotic remains of nearly 300 bodies. For decades, historians assumed these men died in a glorious shield wall battle, swords clashing, axes swinging. We were wrong. New forensic science has revealed a much darker truth. Most of these warriors weren't killed by a Saxon blade. They were killed by something silent, something invisible, and something far more brutal than war. The year is 873 AD. The Great Heathen Army, a massive force of 3,000 Vikings, has vanished into the hostile English countryside. They are deep in enemy territory, surrounded by Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that want them dead, cut off from their ships, and they are facing a historical event known as the Winter of Death. How do you keep an army of 3,000 killers alive when the temperature drops to -20 degrees and the land is frozen solid? Forget the battles. This is not a story about fighting. This is a story about the brutal logistics of survival. How did they eat? How did they sleep without freezing? And what terrifying secret did they leave behind in that mass grave? Let's dig in. When we hear Viking army, we imagine a raiding party, quick, agile, striking from longships. But the Great Heathen Army was different. This wasn't a squad, it was a moving city. Historical estimates suggest up to 3,000 combatants, but armies don't travel alone. Add in the blacksmiths, the cooks, the wives, and the children, and that number easily doubles to 5,000 souls. Now, let's look at the math, because the math is terrifying. A modern soldier in extreme cold needs about 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day just to maintain body heat. Shivering alone burns calories like a furnace. For the Viking commanders, Ivar the Boneless and Ubba, this was a logistical nightmare. To keep 3,000 men fighting fit in freezing temperatures, they needed roughly 6 tons of food every single day. Think about that. They couldn't pop down to a supermarket. They couldn't forage for berries. The ground was frozen rock hard. If supply lines failed for just 3 days, the army wouldn't starve slowly. They would freeze to death in their sleep as their metabolic fires went out. So how did they solve it? Ruthlessness. They turned to what historians call weaponized hunger. They didn't just raid for gold anymore. They raided for protein. They stripped the kingdom of Mercia of its cattle, grain, and livestock. It was a calculated strategy: starve the Saxons to feed the Vikings. But fresh meat rots. The Vikings were masters of food preservation technology. They utilized massive-scale salting and smoking operations. Fish was dried until it was hard as wood, basically pure protein bars that could last for years. This wasn't cooking, this was industrial survival engineering. Once the food was secured, they needed shelter. A tent in a blizzard is just a coffin made of canvas. They needed stone. They chose Repton for a specific reason. It was the royal, spiritual heart of the kingdom of Mercia. But to the Vikings, it was just a defensible position. They situated their camp with the River Trent protecting their backs, a natural highway for escape or supply. But here is the genius part. They took over the Church of St Wystan. Why a church? Not just to insult the Christians, but because churches were the only buildings made of solid stone. In a world of wattle and daub huts, stone is the ultimate insulation. It retains heat. It blocks the wind. They turned the house of God into a barrack of war. Archaeologists found evidence of a massive V-shaped ditch connecting the church to the river, forming a D-shaped fortress. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was a siege engine. Inside these walls, thousands of men huddled together. But as we'll see later, this overcrowding would become their greatest enemy. Let's talk about gear. If you go camping in winter today, you bring Gore-Tex, down jackets, and synthetic thermals. The Vikings had none of that. Yet their kit might have been superior for the conditions they faced. Their secret weapon was biology, specifically lanolin. Vikings wore heavy wool tunics, but they didn't overprocess the wool. They left the natural sheep oils, lanolin, intact. This oil is nature's waterproofing, unlike cotton, which kills you when it gets wet because it sucks heat away from the body. Oily wool repels water and retains heat even when soaked. They understood the layering system 1,000 years before modern mountaineers. Base layer, linen to wick sweat, mid-layer, wool for insulation, outer shell, animal fur cloaks. Fur is incredible because it traps a layer of dead air against the body, creating a microclimate. Essentially, a Viking warrior was walking around in a personal, bioengineered spacesuit. But despite the food, the fortress, and the fur, men started dying. Back to the mass grave. When you pack 3,000 people and animals into a muddy fortress for months with no sewage system, you create a biological time bomb. You create the perfect conditions for dysentery and typhoid. Let's look at the most famous skeleton from Repton, grave 511. This man was a giant buried with a Thor's hammer amulet and a wild boar's tusk between his legs, a sign of the old gods. His bones tell a story of agony. He had a massive sword cut to his thigh, a wound that would have felled a horse. But the bone shows signs of healing. The sword didn't kill him. What killed him and hundreds of others in that pit was likely the microscopic enemy inside the camp. In the stagnant air of the longhouses, the flu or infection could wipe out a squad faster than any Saxon shield wall. The winter of death wasn't just about the cold outside, it was about the rot inside. Yet the army survived. When spring finally broke in 874 AD, the Great Heathen Army didn't retreat. They emerged leaner, harder, and desperate. They split up and conquered nearly all of northern England. The men who walked out of Repton were the survivors of the ultimate natural selection. But survival is only temporary in the Viking Age. 2 centuries later, this era would end not with a whimper, but with one lone Viking holding a bridge against an entire English army. How did one man kill 40 Saxons alone? You'll have to subscribe to find out in our next breakdown. What do you think was the Vikings' greatest enemy, the Saxons or the winter? Let me know in the comments below.